What is up, cyber and crypto homies? Today is Monday, June 17th of 2024. This is episode 113 of the Cybersecurity and Cryptocurrency Podcast. I'm your host, Eric English. All the views and opinions on this podcast are solely my opinions and do not reflect the opinions of my employer. If you want to follow me on Twitter, I'm at CyberCryptoGuy. All right, so we're back in the saddle again here this week, and a couple of things came up in the news that I wanted to kind of run through a little bit and talk about, because these were, they're still kind of ever evolving too, especially with the Snowflake breach or alleged breach. So we're going to dive into that. We're also going to dive into some OpenAI talk about who they hired on their board. And we're also going to talk a little bit about secure browsers. It's kind of been a new, trend here lately. Palo Alto's got one. CyberArk has one now. And I'm trying to buy into the hype here, but I'm having a little bit of difficulty. And so I'm going to talk about some of the things that I've seen, some of the sales pitches that I've heard, and talk about whether or not it's worth, having one of these browsers. So without further ado, I think we'll stay right there on that secure browser topic. So I was looking at the secure browser offering from CyberArk. Palo Alto recently was advertising that they have a secure browser as well now. And, reading through their white paper and everything, I understand you're kind of isolating the browser session. You're eliminating cookies, those things can't be stolen. You're passing the credentials or the token directly from the CyberArk password manager directly to the web application with no user input of those credentials. The user doesn't even have to know what the credentials are. No cookies, no tokens, none of that stuff. So that's all well and good for, the folks that get these credentials and whatnot and everything stolen, and the tokens and cookies stolen. And that happens a lot. Trust me, it does, especially with this new info stealing malware that's out there. And heck, it's now built into Windows 11 through Microsoft Recall. So yeah, you're all those session cookies and tokens and all that fun stuff is what these secure browsers are trying to protect. And I understand the need there for that. However, I'm having a difficult time with, understanding why they chose to use a browser base such as Chromium. And so I know Chrome is what Edge is built on. Of course, Brave is built on it. Chrome is built on it. So, I get it. The problem that I have, we're calling this a secure browser, right? But we all know how many 0 days come out in Google Chrome constantly, right? They patch that thing multiple times a month. And so, if the underlying code to that quote unquote secure browser is vulnerable to 0 days, well, I'm not as confident in using a product like that. And it just kind of makes me wonder, why would they choose a code base such as Chromium, knowing that it is so vulnerable and needs to be patched all the time? So on the one hand, I understand the security behind it and what they're trying to accomplish. On the other hand, I would assume that even these new Chromium-based secure browsers would also require lots and lots of rounds of patching. And so now you're not getting the patch directly from Google into Chrome. It's kind of like using Brave or Edge, right? Those patches and fixes come a little bit later, because now with Brave, it has to go through the Brave developers. They have to push that code. With Microsoft Edge, those Chrome 0 days have to be pushed through Microsoft. And so, as you can imagine, with these secure browsers, you're going to have to patch those things equally as frequent. So the issue that I can see there is, sometimes patching software is limited in the third-party applications that it can patch. Are these secure browsers, do they just auto-update? Do they, mesh up with your patch management system? Is it listed in your patching system? In all likelihood, probably not. So I think that, using these vulnerable code bases or just vulnerable browsers in general kind of defeat the purpose of the secure browser. Now, again, I do kind of applaud where they're trying to go, but I do hope that at some point they come out with a different code base. But I understand too, it's easy just to kind of piggyback off of what Google has already created, and it's kind of the standard for the internet right now. So I kind of understand it on multiple different levels. However, it's just it makes me a little skeptical to use these browsers because they could be potentially just as vulnerable as Google Chrome. So, and of course, it all depends on the vulnerability, right? Some of these 0 days are, able to steal session cookies and things like that. And, if the secure browsers don't allow for these cookies to be saved, okay, well then, maybe that's a little better. But still, nonetheless, I would assume these would have to be patched just as frequently. And I don't know, maybe I'm a little skeptical on these, but I hope that they do eventually create these in some sort of a different code base, like a Firefox, for example. That's, it's not perfect, of course. However, it has much fewer 0 days than Google Chrome does. And of course, it's this way with all the mass adoption of software out there like Microsoft and Google Chrome. Everyone uses this software. And so guess what? It's the most targeted, and there's the most vulnerabilities because it's the most targeted and all that stuff. So I get all of those things too, but kind of makes me wonder a little bit about the security of those secure browsers. Anyway, not to deter you from getting one of those, by the way. Just a little bit hesitant on my part because of the patching side of it. So in some other news here, the Snowflake quote-unquote breach that initially everyone was pointing fingers at Snowflake, saying that, Snowflake had been hacked. And, come to find out, even from Mandiant and I believe CrowdStrike also performed lots of incident response for the Snowflake folks. And they came back and said there was no intrusion of the Snowflake systems. However, certain customers were targeted, specifically customers that weren't using, guess what? Roll the drums here. Multi-factor. When are we going to make this a standard here? I mean, this is crazy to me to see that, people are putting their data in these cloud-based systems without multi-factor. It is really mind-boggling. And here we go. All these folks are pointing a finger at Snowflake saying, oh, you guys got hacked, and come to find out, no, these certain customers were targeted and they weren't using multi-factor, and boom. And Snowflake even came out and released a statement about all of this and said that they even disabled some customer accounts that showed malicious activity and all kinds of fun stuff. So they were taking some appropriate action on their side. But the fact that everyone was blaming them for the hack is a little messed up, but I understand people are quick to jump to conclusions, especially when multiple organizations were claiming breach here, and then now all of a sudden, oh, hey, by the way, it wasn't actually Snowflake that was hacked. It was these individual corporations or businesses that were targeted and hacked because they didn't use multi-factor. So here's yet another reason for you to go and use multi-factor everywhere you can. So it's still fascinating to me that certain sites don't require multi-factor. And by the way, I think the hugest a word? The largest issue, in my opinion, with multi-factor and the adoption of multi-factor is in our financial industry. They are still heavily reliant on text message multi-factor. And to me, that's just mind-boggling that we haven't moved to a passkey. Now, I will say for, cash management customers, business accounts and things like that to do ACHs and wires, they do require a physical security token. However, for the consumer base that just has checking and savings accounts, it's a text message for multi-factor. And sometimes it's an email for multi-factor, which is probably the most pointless multi-factor mechanism out there, because if someone hacks your email and your MFA codes are going to your email, well, that's not really MFA, I would say. Yeah, so I'm just really shocked that our banking systems haven't been, I guess, upgraded enough, or, that the banks haven't adopted a more secure form of multi-factor, especially with all of the the FDIC and the OCC audits that happen, at these huge banks. And, there's this FFIEC framework that all the banks have to follow and yada, yada, yada. And here we are using text message MFA. Wow. The other fascinating thing about banks, if you didn't know this, is the vast majority of them use what's called an AS400 IBM mainframe for all the transaction processing and fun stuff like that. They call it their banking core or their core system. And to me, that's also very fascinating because an AS400, this was created back in like 1980 1988, I want to say, or maybe 90. Wow, like we're still using an IBM mainframe from that long ago. And the fact that, a ton of banks are running on these IBM mainframes to me is just really fascinating as well, because I don't know how secure those can still be, and maybe they are, right? Maybe they're just so obscure that, again, it goes back to my earlier point of this mass software adoption. The public isn't using AS400 systems at home to browse the internet, right? So hackers aren't targeting these systems, but, most of the banking world is built on these AS400s. And there's even huge companies like Fiserv and Jack Henry, and I believe even CSI and McCoy Myers, all these companies that use or that host AS400s for their customers. They offer it as a service. So it's core banking as a service, which most of the small community banks use. And again, it's all running on old school green screen AS400. It's just fascinating. And maybe this probably goes back to why they're still using text message MFA potentially. I don't know. I don't understand all the inner workings of all of that. But maybe that is somehow a limitation, is the AS400 is just getting in the way of that. I can't fathom that being the reason, because if you have a web front end that's just querying, the AS400 database on the back end, the web front end can authenticate you any way you set it up to. So I have a feeling that's not a limitation, but who knows? Maybe it is, right? Like it's just wild that we're still using text message or email based MFA at all anywhere, and especially in the financial world. But I guess, there's so much pushback from customers, and they don't want to have, the Google Authenticator app or Authy or Microsoft Authenticator, or even, I think Bitwarden now has a Authenticator app, by the way, which is pretty slick. I use their password manager quite a bit, but shameless plug there. I don't get paid for any of these, by the way. It's just stuff that I like to use. And there's no advertising on my podcast. I don't take advertising money. I specifically do that because I just want this to be completely free and open, just open information from my experiences and some of my opinions and stuff. So anyway, I guess that's my my rant about MFA and the whole Snowflake debacle that was really just continuing to spiral. And you were thinking, oh my gosh, is this another SolarWinds type of attack? And, come to find out, well, actually, no, it's not. So folks, use multi-factor everywhere you can, please. In future shows, by the way, I think what I was thinking about doing is, kind of doing a personal security kind of 101 podcast, grouping of podcasts, just do a couple of topics, for 5 or 10 podcasts, and just about basic personal security and some of the ways that you can protect yourself to help prevent identity theft and fun stuff like that. So look for that in the coming weeks here as I continue the podcast. Some tinfoil hat stuff here coming up, so get ready. If you read the news, I guess it came out today or yesterday, I want to say, I can't remember which, but OpenAI hired an ex-NSA director to be on its board. And Edward Snowden had some fun comments about this, and he basically said, OpenAI is not to be trusted. You have been warned. And, Snowden, I think a lot of people, everybody has their opinion about Snowden, right? They say, oh, it was horrible what he did, and some say, oh, he's a hero. Well, I'm kind of in the middle. I don't really care one way or the other. I think that, we all kind of knew that the government was spying on us, right? But I guess we just didn't know to what extent. And Snowden really helped shine a light on a lot of that, which I think was good in ways, but also kind of bad in other ways, because now some of the cat was out of the bag, essentially, right? And so now everyone knows that this is happening, and so now everyone's going to be trying to hide more. So, and everybody's like, oh, you're fine if you have nothing to hide. Well, that's not always the case, but we won't go too far into that. But if you want to get out your tinfoil hats here about what Edward Snowden is saying about no longer being able to trust OpenAI, and frankly, I have to agree with him that this is a scary thing to see, and you never really know if this, allegedly it's an ex-NSA director, right? I'm not even sure I can say his last name correctly. Nakasone, 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 Paul Nakasone. I guess that's how you say it. Probably butchering that, but anyway, you have to wonder, is he still really working for the NSA and just kind of doing this on the side? Is he truly, fully removed from the NSA? But then it makes you wonder why they would hire somebody like this to be on the board. Are they going to help, is this person going to help, OpenAI do some shady stuff and hide it from people, right? It just all the conspiracy theories are starting to swirl, and it really makes you wonder. And OpenAI just announced a partnership with Apple here recently as well. So they're working with Microsoft and Apple. So apparently they're going to integrate it in with their, Apple Assistant Siri. So, this is something that we all have to be very cautious of. And, personally, I'm opting out of all AI stuff because I don't get a whole ton of value out of it personally. And I know that it does help, speed up certain processes, and I get it. That's great. But I think it's really being forced down our throats. I'm not really using it that much. So I just opt out. I guess I'm kind of old school in that way. But regardless, I don't really need an OpenAI to summarize stuff for me. And I don't write code very often. So for me, it's just not as useful. So, and I realize you can use it for other things too, but that would be kind of my use cases at work at least. But I guess I'd like to hear everybody's thoughts on what do you think about them hiring an ex-NSA director? Does that make you trust them more, or would you be a little more skeptical now of OpenAI? Because now they're being used in Apple products here coming up very, very soon. So something to definitely keep your eye on, and just, protect yourself as best you can, because you just never really know kind of what's going on in the background there. So as always, be cautious. All right. And then jumping over to some cryptocurrency topics. Don't have a ton today, at least not right now anyway. I'll try to have some more in following episodes, but just a quick update on the pricing right now of Bitcoin. You're at 66,000 roughly. It is down a little bit. It was around 70 last week, so it's dipping a little. Ethereum's at 3,500, so a little bit of dips there. And as you know, everything follows Bitcoin just about. So as Bitcoin dips, so does the rest of the market, unfortunately. So we're seeing kind of dips all across the board. And XRP, or Ripple, they're right around 50 cents. And I wanted to briefly touch on Ripple and kind of their story, but they, I was a huge Ripple advocate 5-6 years ago, whatever it was, and was really, I liked what they were doing. They were trying to actually make it a useful cryptocurrency. And they had deals with like MoneyGram and all these places for cross-border payments, and it was looking very promising. And then they had some lawsuits take place, and I think that really just killed their business and their market share a little bit. And it's unfortunate, but their price really has never gotten much higher than like $1 something. I want to say we were at, the peak was $3.84, but anytime recently, we got about to 95 cents last year roughly. So almost $1, but it's just been kind of floating around, 30 to 50 cents. And it's at 50 cents again right now. And it's unfortunate, but I haven't heard hardly any, hype or news about Ripple, and it's unfortunate because, when they came out, and I guess it was 2016, 2017, when they first started, there was a lot of hype behind it. And they had a lot of companies that were, really going to buy in and use it for cross-border payments. Like I said, MoneyGram and a couple other businesses were, I think even Santander were going to start using them. But then it just kind of died off. And then they had this huge SEC lawsuit, and it just really just killed their market share, unfortunately. But I'm hoping that, just for the sake of it, I hope that they can finally break over I guess 384 was their high, but I'm hoping they can get up, to $10 or $15 at some point. And I hope that, that their business actually does take off again, because what they were, offering with the cross-border payments, super fast, you can convert that currency immediately with much, much smaller fees. And the utility was certainly there, unlike a lot of these meme coins out here where it's just, they're out there for jokes and free money essentially. So hoping for Ripple there that they finally come out of the hole and start doing something. But at this rate, I just think that it's almost a lost cause, unfortunately. If you ever use the Brave browser, the BAT token, Basic Attention Token, is built into their browser to help you pay certain websites that you visit a lot. You can kind of tip them, I guess, if you will. Their token's sitting around 20 cents right now. So not super great, but it's also never really gotten super high either. But it's kind of interesting that that's built into the Brave browser, and really not a lot of other browsers have done that. So it's kind of cool. And Brave touts their security and privacy and all that good stuff. So if you're interested in that BAT token, if you use the Brave browser, it's the little red and white triangle in the kind of near the address bar, on the far right of the address bar. So you can click on that, and it'll have to show you some advertisements from Brave, but then you can get BAT tokens in reward for those. So kind of a cool little deal. Anyway, that's all I got for today, folks. Appreciate everybody listening. And next week, I think I'll start the personal security podcast sessions and try to do a few of those about what I do for personal security and my recommendations for securing your identity, your personal home network, your computers, all kinds of fun stuff like that. Thanks again. We'll talk again next week.